Hey, Ohio, it's September 12th, 2025. Today, I want to talk about how Ohio makes revenue, right? How we get our revenue, and then how we spend it, okay? And I want to talk about this because we've had a lot of conversations, or I've done a lot of videos talking about property taxes and school funding and the state budget, and I get a lot of comments that say things like, well, why doesn't the lottery money pay for schools? Why doesn't the marijuana revenue pay for, get rid of property taxes, et cetera? And so I think it's really important to have this conversation, not only to look at how we generate revenue, but the numbers themselves, because they're big numbers. And sometimes it's hard to conceptualize how much money it takes to run things. So I want to root this conversation first in the difference between a million and a billion. So I think the time example is a great way to do this. So 1 million seconds is 11.5 days. 1 billion seconds is 31.7 years. It is a huge difference, okay? So we need to keep that in mind as we're talking about these numbers, but let's jump right in. The Ohio General Revenue Fund is about $44 billion. Now this fluctuates a little bit from year to year, but on average, it's been about $44 billion. The largest share of that is a federal contribution. So 33% roughly is from a federal contribution. However, that federal money is mainly earmarked already for things like Medicaid and Health and Human Services. So this portion is really not included when we talk about the state share of our general revenue fund. And that's important because it's the state share of our general revenue fund that our legislators are deciding in the budget where that money goes, right? So how do we generate revenue for the state share of funding for those things in our state budget? So we do it through sales tax, okay? So when you go buy something and there's sales tax, we do it through personal income taxes, and then we do it through other taxes, so that we have a commercial activity tax. We don't have a corporate tax rate here in Ohio. We have a commercial activity tax, and then a few other taxes kind of built in there. But again, the largest pies are sales tax and personal income tax. Sales tax by nature are a regressive tax. What do I mean by that? I mean that lower income families pay a higher share of their income in sales taxes than higher income families. I think the perfect example of this is, there's a family of four and they generate or bring in $50,000 in their income yearly. And then you have a family of four that brings in $500,000 of their income annually. They go to the store, they buy the same amount of toilet paper. There's a tax on that toilet paper. However, that tax, right, for that lower income family is a larger portion of their income than it is for a family making $500,000. That's just the example of a regressive tax. Now, personal income taxes make up a slightly smaller share, right, in this general revenue fund. And we used to have in Ohio a progressive income tax structure where we had brackets where the more wealthy you were, the higher the tax rate you paid on that wealth. We no longer have that. They cut that basically, they've been cutting it over the last 20 years, but in the most recent budget, they implemented something called the flat tax, where basically they made everybody that makes over $27,000 a year pays the same 2.7% flat tax rate on their income, okay? Again, this is a more regressive tax because it's going to put more strain on low-income families because they're going to be paying essentially more, a higher percentage of their income in taxes than higher income families. And so that's something just to keep in mind. This portion has shrunk over time in our general revenue fund. It used to actually make up more than sales tax, which was actually I would say a more equitable or fair way to raise money in our general revenue fund. But again, as Republican legislators in our state house have continued to cut income taxes for wealthy people, this has shrunk this share, and we have lost billions of dollars in revenue over the years because of it. Now, let's talk about, so that 44 billion that I mentioned, when we subtract out the federal contribution, right, which is a large portion, we are left with about $30 billion, right? So that's what kind of we have to play with for, I would say, our state budget and how we spend money on things. And you can see here a breakdown of how we spend that money. The largest share goes to K through 12 education. And then we spend about 10% on higher education. About 16% goes to Medicaid, the state share of Medicaid. Again, the majority of the Medicaid dollars come from the federal government, but we do pay a state share. And then 8 to 9% around that on corrections, about 8% on Health and Human Services, and then about 4% on something called the local government fund and the library fund. This local government fund percentage has shrunk over time, which I've talked about in another video, has led to rising property taxes. So let's look at then K through 12 funding overall, right? So K through 12 funding is basically made up of state budget money, right, which they just decided in their state budget back in July, property taxes, and then federal funding. Now, what is the breakdown of how much each of those are contributing? Because that's important here. So in the state budget, there is about $9.25 billion allocated in this most recent budget to K through 12 funding. So that's about 36%. 1.25 billion of that annually is going to the private school voucher program with no accountability in how that money is being spent. So that's taxpayer dollars being taken away from public education and shifted towards private education, again with no accountability, leaving public education with about $8 billion a year to work with through the state budget funding. Now, property taxes had contributed, and I think this was the 2024 estimate because we don't have 2025, $13.6 billion to K through 12 funding. That's about 50% of the total funding that goes to K through 12 funding came from property taxes and a smaller portion of local income tax. Property taxes were about 13 billion, and then local income taxes made up about 0.6 billion, so that's $600 million in this fund. So high percentage, right, coming from property taxes. This is unconstitutional, right, because it is a higher share than the state's share is paying. And then federal funding chips in about $3 billion, making about 12% of that funding, okay? Now, thinking of those numbers, right? So how, again, these are big numbers, 9.25 billion, 13.6 billion, 3 billion. Keeping those numbers in mind, I want to talk about, well, when people say, well, what about the lottery money? What about, why isn't that paying for schools? And then we won't have to pay property taxes. This is why, because the lottery profit, so that's what we get after lottery prizes are paid out and vendors are paid, schools, K through 12 schools get all of the lottery profit. That is $1.5 billion. That is essentially, I mean, it's a large number, right? But it is a drop in the bucket when it comes to entirely funding public education or K through 12 education in our state, right? And then people will say, well, what about sports gambling? You know, that's a big thing now. What about the tax revenue for that? And agree, we should use that tax revenue wisely. That generated annually right now about $180 million. Again, a very small drop in the bucket when you're looking at these numbers. And most of that money is going to schools, but it's going to extracurricular or athletic activities. Again, $180 million is a big chunk of money, but again, you have to keep it in perspective when we're looking at the funding costs to fund all K through 12 education in our state. And then a lot of people, like I said, they'll say, you know, what about the marijuana tax revenue? That should, you know, I had somebody say it should eliminate property taxes, like problem solved, bada bing, bada boom. And I'm like, well, the marijuana tax revenue this past year was $122 million. $122 million. Now, that's projected to increase in the next 5 years to $250 to $400 million. But again, that in no way is going to make this number go away or this number go away, like at all. And before anybody starts going, well, why are we spending so much money on K through 12 funding? When we compare the state of Ohio to other states across the country, we are kind of right in the average of spending per pupil. When you look at a state like Michigan, right, which is very similar to Ohio, their per pupil funding of education is pretty much the same as Ohio, but what's different is these ratios are pretty much flipped, right? Because they're paying a larger portion of the K through 12 funding through the state budget rather than through property tax dollars. And I've talked about this a lot, how we need to, rather than saying these things, and again, it's not a wrong thing to suggest like, oh, what about this money? But I think it's important to know that if we keep saying things like this, we're distracting from the real problem here, which is they need, through our state budget, the Republican lawmakers in our state house, they needed to fully implement the bipartisan fair school funding plan with updated inputs, which would have increased this state budget amount, okay? And then it takes off the pressure off of property tax or property owners through having to increase property taxes to fund schools in our state, right? So again, I think it's just so important to keep those numbers in mind, and that these things, yes, while they can help contribute, and they do, right, they're never going to make up all of the funding that's needed for those things. I also put here the gas tax. A lot of people also comment on my videos like, well, we're taxed on gas and we're taxed on when we get a permit for our vehicle and our registration. And yes, I know it feels like everywhere you go you're taxed, but those taxes go to something called the Ohio Transportation Fund. That's not part of this, okay? And so our state gas tax raises about $2.6 billion for the state, and then vehicle registration permits, title fees, et cetera, is about 1.3 billion. That totals about 3.9 billion, and then the federal government chips in a couple of billion too towards this fund. And this is a great graphic here, essentially showing all of the revenue that comes that I just talked about here. And it creates about $6 billion in revenue for the Ohio Transportation Fund, and then where that money is allocated. And it's mainly allocated to our highways, our bridges, local roads, running the BMV, running the State Highway Patrol, and then a smaller portion goes to rail, aviation, etc. And it's important to know that doing all those things, maintaining our roads costs a lot of money. And repairing infrastructure costs a lot of money. Just for example, the Brent Spence Bridge project, which is a giant project, right? But it's gonna cost over $3 billion to do that one project. Now, because it spans Kentucky and Ohio, we're gonna split the cost of that along with the federal government, but you can see these projects take a lot of money, right? And so I would say, if you're really upset about the gas tax and the vehicle, you feel like you're taxed everywhere, fight for public transit and increase access to public transit, right? I mean, that's what we should be doing. But I think, again, it's important to keep that in perspective. Why? It's because we want to drive on roads that are maintained, safe, etc. I think that will kind of wrap it up here. I hope that was helpful. I'm going to do a further video talking about how in Ohio we have gotten further and further away from a progressive tax structure, and we have gone further and further to a regressive tax structure, and how that is stressing low-income people and basically allowing wealthy people to get wealthier. But it's really important because we need this share of the general revenue fund to actually increase over time if we're going to be able to pay for these things. And I really think that I'm worried about this going away completely. So we've had some Republican lawmakers and the current GOP candidate for governor, Vivek Ramaswamy, has said they want to get rid of income taxes in our state. I think this would be a horrible idea because, again, that's taking a huge chunk of funding out of our general revenue fund, again, that pays for things like education in our state, and they've really not come up with a way that we're going to make up that revenue loss. They say they're not going to increase sales tax, which, again, I agree with. I don't want them to increase sales tax because that's a regressive tax, but there's really no feasible way to make up that revenue. They just keep saying we're going to have a large economic boom, and I know there's a lot of people sitting here going, well, why do I have to pay for public education or K through 12 education? I don't have any kids, etc. And I have said it before and I'll say it again. Everybody benefits from other people's kids being educated. And if we don't have funding to pay for these things, right, what happens is, again, property taxes go up. But again, if there's groups that are wanting to abolish property taxes, our state isn't paying for these things, public schools will fail, and trust me, that will eventually affect you. So let's go forth, Ohio.